A few years back, I worked as a manager at a small Save a Lot grocery store. If you're not familiar with it, Save a Lot is a popular grocery store chain in the Florida area, where I'm from. As a manager, my job was to handle all sorts of tasks. And I worked all kinds of hours whenever they needed me. Some days were busier than others. But I was always ready to step in and help whenever I could. One evening, I was working the night shift, handling things in the customer service area. It was an average night. We had a decent number of customers coming through, but it wasn't too hectic. As I was going about my tasks, the store phone rang. That wasn't too unusual. People often called to ask about store hours, returns, or whether we had a certain product in stock. But this call was different. I picked up the phone and said my usual greeting, asking how I could help you. The person on the other end was a man, and his voice was deep and unsettling. What he said next sent a chill down my spine. "I'm going to get you," he said. That's all. Just those 5 words. I was caught off guard. "Excuse me?" I replied, hoping I had misunderstood him. But the man didn't say anything more. He just hung up the phone. I stood there for a moment, feeling uneasy. What did he mean by that? Who was he? But then I thought about it and convinced myself it was probably just a prank. After all, teenagers sometimes think it's funny to make prank calls, especially to places like grocery stores. But the voice didn't sound like a teenager, though it sounded like a grown man. Still, I shrugged it off and went back to work. As the night went on, the store began to quiet down. The crowds thinned out, and soon only a handful of customers were left. I continued with my duties, trying to push that creepy phone call out of my mind. But then, around 10 p.m., the phone rang again. I picked it up without thinking much about it. But when I heard the voice on the other end, my stomach dropped. It was the same man. This time, he said, "I'm inside the store." My heart started racing. I asked him who he was, but he didn't answer. He just hung up again. I looked around the store, trying to spot anything out of the ordinary. There were still a few customers browsing the aisles, but nothing seemed off. I wanted to believe it was still just a prank, but there was a small part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more. As the night went on, the store began to quiet down. The crowds thinned out, and soon only a handful of customers were left. I continued with my duties, trying to push that creepy phone call out of my mind. The phone rang again. This time I wasn't right next to the phone, but I walked over to answer it anyway. When I picked up, there was nothing on the other end. No sound, no breathing, just silence. I asked if anyone was there, but no one responded. Then the line went dead. I hung up, had a mix of confusion and frustration. Was this the same guy? Was he trying to scare me? I couldn't make sense of it, but I was starting to get more and more nervous. Just as I was about to walk away from the phone, it rang again. Now I was annoyed. I picked up the phone, ready to give whoever it was a piece of my mind. I told them to stop calling and that we had work to do. At first there was just silence on the other end, but then the man spoke again, in that same slow, deep voice. He said my name and told me to calm down. Then he hung up. My blood ran cold. How did he know my name? The only thing I could think of was that he had seen my name tag if he was really in the store. But that thought didn't make me feel any better. I tried to shake it off and focus on finishing my shift. Thankfully, there were no more calls for the rest of the night. By midnight, the store was closed, and I was ready to go home. Only a few of us were left in the building, finishing up the last few tasks before heading out. By 12:15 a.m., I was finally done and I left the store to walk to my car, which was parked in the back of the lot. As I got into my car and started the engine, my cell phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw that it was an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't answer a call from a number I didn't recognize, but something made me pick up the call. When I did, I heard that same voice again, the man who had been calling the store. At first, I was just annoyed, thinking, not this guy again. But then it hit me. This wasn't the store phone he was calling. This was my personal cell phone. Now I was really creeped out. How did he get my number? Before I could even process that, he spoke again. "I'm on my way to your house." He spoke. "See you there." Then he hung up. I sat in my car frozen. How did he know where I lived? How did he get my number? My mind was racing, trying to figure out if this was still some kind of sick joke or it was something scarier. I started driving home, my heart pounding the whole way. It took me about 10 minutes to get there, and during that drive, I kept telling myself that there was no way this guy was serious. There was no way he could actually be at my house. But as I turned around my street, I noticed something strange. There was a car parked right in front of my house. That spot was usually where I parked, and it was rare for anyone else to park there. My mind started racing again. Was this the guy? Was he really here? I drove past the car slowly, trying to get a look inside. But the windows were dark and I couldn't see anyone inside. My heart was pounding in my chest. Could this really be happening? I kept driving, not wanting to stop and risk anything. I had a terrible feeling about the whole situation. As I reached the end of the street, I decided to turn around. I started backing up, my headlights now facing my house. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a man hidden behind a bush right next to my front door. My headlights must have startled him because he moved slightly, trying to hide further behind the bush. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like something out of a horror movie. I knew someone was there, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out who it was. I finished turning my car around and sped away, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. I told the dispatcher everything, and they sent a police car to my house. Just as I finished talking to the dispatcher, my phone rang again. Without thinking, I answered it, hoping it was the police calling me back. But it wasn't. It was the man again. "Come back to your house," he said in that same deep, terrifying voice. Then he hung up before I could say anything. I wanted to tell him that the police were on their way, but I'm glad I didn't. If I had, he might have run off before they got there. Instead, I waited a safe distance until the police arrived at my house. They called me when they got there, and I drove back, my heart pounding the whole time. When I arrived, the police were waiting for me. They told me that they had caught a man on my property. He had been hiding behind my house, under a small deck in my backyard. When they brought him out, I finally got a good look at him, and I recognized him. He was a former employee at the Save a Lot where I worked. Everything started to make sense. He had worked at the store, which is how he knew to call there. He must have found my personal phone number somehow, maybe from an old employee contact list or something like that. I later learned that he had been fired and maybe he blamed me for it, even though I wasn't the one who fired him. Maybe he just chose me as his target for whatever reason. That night was one of the scariest experiences I've ever had, and it still haunts me to this day. You never know who's watching, who's holding a grudge, or who might be waiting in the shadows, ready to make their move. It's a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't just in our heads, they're real, and they could be closer than you think. My name is James, and I live in a small, quiet town called New Wimberley. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other, and nothing much ever happens. But that all changed one early August morning, the first day of school. Unfortunately, I was held back a year, so I had to return as a 19-year-old senior. In a small town like mine, the middle school and high school are in the same building, so I knew most of the kids already. It was a small school, so it wasn't unusual to recognize every face in the hallways. That day, my first period was study hall. I walked into the classroom, expecting the usual group of students, but something was different. There was a new kid sitting alone on the other side of the room. He seemed out of place, like he didn't belong there. I figured he must be new, so I decided to go over and introduce myself. "Hey, I'm James," I said, trying to be friendly. He looked up at me with a strange expression, like he was sizing me up. "I'm Steven," he replied. "I just moved here." I offered to show him around the school, and he accepted. As we walked through the hallways, pointing out classrooms and the cafeteria, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. At first, his questions were normal. He asked how long I'd been at the school and where our classrooms were. But then his questions took a strange turn. "What's your address?" he asked out of nowhere. I stopped in my tracks, surprised. It was a weird question, especially from someone I had just met. "Why do you want to know my address?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He spoke, "Just curious." I decided not to give him my address, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to give him my Snapchat ID, so I did. After that, I tried to put the whole scenario out of my mind and went on with my day. The last period of the day was English class. When I walked in, I noticed that there were only about 9 kids in the room. It was the lowest level English class, so I wasn't surprised that it was small. I took my seat and started getting ready for class when I noticed Steven sitting on the other side of the room. He was eating a disgusting looking sandwich, but that wasn't the weirdest part. He was staring right at me. He gestured for me to come over to him, but I ignored him. Mr. Adam, our English teacher, was about to start the lesson, and I didn't want to get into trouble. But Steven didn't stop. A few minutes later, I glanced up from my book and saw him staring at me again, this time with a look of anger on his face. He gestured for me to come over again, but I pretended not to notice and kept reading. Then my phone pinged. It was a Snapchat message from Steven. "Follow me," it said. I quickly replied, "I can't, we're in the middle of class." Steven didn't respond. Instead, he got up from his seat and asked Mr. Adam if he could go to the bathroom. Once he left the room, I couldn't help but wonder what he was up to. After a few minutes, my curiosity got the better of me, so I asked Mr. Adam if I could go to the bathroom too. I stepped into the hallway, but Steven was nowhere in sight. I walked down each hallway, trying to find him. And eventually I spotted him about 50 feet away, walking slowly. I kept my distance so he wouldn't know I was following him. He turned down a hallway that wasn't used much. It was mostly for storage, bathrooms and offices. Then I saw him open a door and walk inside. He closed the door behind him, and I realized it was the door to the school's basement. My heart started pounding in my chest. There was no way I was going down there. The basement was dark, creepy and full of old, forgotten things. I turned around and headed back to class, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. When I got back to the classroom, my phone pinged again. It was another message from Steven. "Why didn't you come to the basement?" he asked. He followed up with a picture of himself, still eating that gross sandwich, but this time he was in the basement. The final message sent a chill down my spine. "Come down here." At that point, I was really creeped out. I replied, telling him to leave me alone. Then I blocked him. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about Steven and why he wanted me to go into that basement. Later that night, I tried to distract myself by focusing on my homework. Before I knew it, it was 11 p.m. and I was finally done. I was home alone and the house was quiet. Just as I was about to put my homework away, my phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had added me on Snapchat. The username sent a shiver down my spine. "Why didn't you enter the basement?" It was Steven. I blocked the account immediately, but a few minutes later, I got another friend request. This time the username was, "Why did you block me?" I blocked that one too, but another request came almost instantly. The username was even more unsettling. "I know where you live." And then the final message that made my blood run cold. "I'm right outside your house." Right after I read that, I heard the sound of glass shattering downstairs. Panic arrived through me as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My hands were shaking as I told the operator what was happening. She told me to find a safe place to hide and lock the door. I hung up and quickly ran to the hallway closet. I squeezed inside, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Then I heard footsteps. They started downstairs but quickly moved to the second floor. I could hear the floor creaking as someone walked down the hallway, getting closer to the closet. I held my breath and peeked through the small crack in the closet door. My blood ran cold when I saw him. It was Steven. He was standing at the end of the hallway, staring straight ahead into the darkness. He didn't seem to notice me, but then, as if sensing something, he slowly turned his head and looked right at the closet door. I quickly pulled back, pressing myself against the back wall of the closet. I could hear him moving closer, his footsteps getting louder. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. I thought he wouldn't leave. But then the door closed and I heard his footsteps moving away, back down the hallway. I waited, my heart still racing, until I heard the sound of sirens outside. The police had arrived. I stayed hidden for a few more seconds just to be sure, and then I carefully opened the closet door. I ran downstairs and flung open the front door, nearly collapsing in relief when I saw the police officer standing on my front yard. I quickly told them what had happened, but by the time they searched the house, Steven was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. They found out that he had escaped through a window in the basement. The police took down the information about the Snapchat accounts, promising to do their best to trace them. But I knew that finding him wouldn't be easy. The next day I went to school and immediately went to the principal's office to report Steven. But what the principal told me was the most chilling thing of all. He looked at me with a confused expression and said, "James, there's no student named Steven at this school. We have no records of anyone by that name." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. They checked the security cameras, and what they found was even more disturbing. The footage showed Steven sneaking in through a back entrance of the school, blending in with the other students. He had never been a student there at all. He was just a stranger who had somehow managed to infiltrate our school. After that, I never saw Steven again. The police never found him, and I never got any more creepy messages on Snapchat. But to this day, I still think about that night. I still wonder what would have happened if I had followed him into the basement. All I know is that Steven was probably the most dangerous person I have ever met, and I don't want to imagine what his intentions were.
My name is Olivia, and this is a story I never thought I'd have to tell. I work part-time in the cosmetics department of a drugstore, mostly in the evenings. Being a student, those late shifts fit into my schedule perfectly. It wasn't a bad neighborhood at all. It was middle to upper class. I never really felt scared working there at night. After all, there were always at least 4 employees in the store at any given time. But no matter how nice a neighborhood seems, trouble always finds its way in. The store's theft rate had hit an all-time high, mostly happening during the evenings. To make things safer for both the staff and the store's products, the company hired a security firm to watch over the store, especially the cosmetics section. It was a relief, really. The cosmetics department was tucked away in a quiet corner of the store, and only one person, usually a woman, worked in that section at a time. So having a security guard nearby was comforting, especially on long, lonely nights. I worked 4 evenings a week, and another girl, Janice, covered the rest. The schedule was pretty consistent, and it didn't take long before I noticed that the same guard was always there when I worked. He was a guy around 25, not exactly handsome, but he was friendly enough. His name was Lucas. Lucas would stand near my counter in his uniform, just his presence scaring away anyone with bad intentions. We often chatted to pass the time, and I, being the overly talkative person I am, shared more than I probably should have. I noticed after a while that he was the only guard scheduled during my shifts. When I asked him about it, he said, "Yeah, you're stuck with me now." At the time, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just coincidence. One evening, I went to the store on my night off to pick something up. When I walked in, I saw a different guard with Janice. Confused, I said, "Oh, it must be Lucas's night off." The other guard, without missing a beat, replied, "Lucas only works Sunday through Wednesday." A chill ran down my spine. That was my exact schedule. My naive 20-year-old brain tried to brush it off as a coincidence. Life went on as usual, until the strange encounters started piling up. First, I ran into Lucas at a movie theater in my town. He had told me before that he lived 20 minutes away, in a town that had its own theater. Why would he drive all the way to my town? Then, he started showing up at my work on days when I picked up extra shifts, even though he wasn't supposed to be on duty. He claimed he was on lunch, and that he now got his prescriptions from our store because the service was better. I casually asked the pharmacy tech if Lucas had filled any prescriptions that day. She said no. The real turning point came one evening when Lucas showed me pictures from a road trip he had taken. I was swiping through his phone looking at scenic photos when I accidentally swiped one too many times. There it was, a full-blown half-naked pic. I froze, then quickly handed the phone back, laughing nervously. Oops. I think I went too far, but Lucas didn't seem embarrassed at all. Instead, he smirked and said, I was hoping you'd see that. The creepy grin on his face sent shivers down my spine. That was when I knew something was seriously wrong. The next morning, I called his security company. I didn't want to get Lucas in too much trouble, but I told them I was uncomfortable and asked if they could switch his post or at least adjust his schedule. They listened, and the next night, a different guard was stationed at the store. I felt relieved, until the real terror began. When my shift ended that night and we locked up the store, I heard the sound of a car engine starting. It was coming from a dark corner of the parking lot. My stomach twisted in knots as I realized it was the same car Lucas drove. He had parked in the shadows, watching us. Trying to convince myself it was just someone else with a similar car, I hurried to my own vehicle. But when I got there, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. My heart raced as I read it. "I'm so sad my location got changed. I'll try to come back to your store soon. In the meantime, let's get together." He had even left his phone number. I felt sick. My hands shook as I drove home. The next day I called his supervisor again, this time telling him everything about the note, the stalking, the half-naked pic. My store manager, a no-nonsense kind of guy, also called and told the security company that Lucas was no longer welcome at our store. For a few weeks, things seemed to return to normal. Lucas was gone and I hadn't heard from him. I thought I was safe. I even stopped telling my boyfriend and family about it because I didn't want to worry them. But then one dark, rainy evening, everything changed. I was setting up a new fall collection, and the rain made it nearly impossible to see out into the parking lot. The store's large windows only reflected the bright lights inside. As I knelt down to stock a bottom shelf, I heard a car horn honk outside. I glanced up out of habit and caught sight of something terrifying in the window's reflection. Lucas was standing behind me, just staring. I jumped up, heart pounding. He didn't say a word, just stood there with that same creepy grin on his face. I quickly walked to the other side of the store where my manager was working. When I told him what had happened, he rushed back to the cosmetics department. But by the time he got there, Lucas was gone. We checked the security footage later, and sure enough, there he was, standing motionless behind me, watching. That night, my manager called the security company again, only to find out that Lucas had quit his job after being told to stay away from our store. You might wonder why I didn't call the police sooner, but at the time it didn't seem like a big enough threat. No one had been hurt yet. It wasn't until I told my boyfriend and parents that they convinced me to take more precautions. From then on, I stopped driving myself to work. My boyfriend or parents would drop me off and pick me up. One Sunday night, though, my parents were out of town, and my boyfriend had a meeting he couldn't miss. I had to drive myself to work. I parked in the far end of the parking lot, right near a river that had some benches by it. It was a creepy, dark spot with almost no lights, but it was the only place left to park. After my shift ended, I started walking to my car. That's when I heard a voice that sent a jolt of terror through me. "Why would you do this to me? Why make me think you wanted me?" It was Lucas. Just as panic set in, I saw Jim, the pharmacist, taking out the trash. I ran to him, shouting, "Call 911, the police arrived." But Lucas had vanished without a trace. I never saw him again, and to this day I hope I never do. Hi, my name is Alice, and this is my story. It was winter break in 2009. I was staying in an apartment about 15 minutes from the university I attended. I had an internship I needed to stay in town for, and while all my roommates went home to be with their families, I was left alone. Honestly, I didn't mind it. I liked the peace and quiet. It gave me time to focus on my work without any distractions. Plus, flights back home were ridiculously expensive. Staying in town seemed like the better choice. The first 2 weeks were pretty uneventful. I spent my days working, binge watching TV shows, and enjoying the empty apartment. But after a while, that peaceful calm started to feel a bit too lonely. As the silence stretched on, I started to notice small sounds I hadn't before. The creak of the old pipes, the gentle hum of the heater, and the occasional knock of the wind against the windows. Things felt normal until they didn't. Back at the start of the semester, my friends and I met this guy who lived in the building across from us. His name was Ryan. At first we didn't think much of him, but there was always something a little off about him. He'd go out of his way to talk to us whenever we were heading out to the parking lot or hanging out on the steps outside our apartment building. He was always a little too eager to strike up conversations. One time, while we were all talking, he nervously asked for my phone number. I didn't feel comfortable giving it to him, so instead I gave him my Instagram handle. It felt like the safer option. That decision would come back to haunt me. At first, his messages were harmless. He'd DM me every now and then, asking how things were going or if I'd be on campus that day. Harmless, but it still felt off. Something about his overfamiliar tone made me uncomfortable. Then the messages got weirder. He sent me photos of my apartment. Pictures taken from across the street with captions like, "So you come home earlier," or "Your lights look nice tonight." That's when I started regretting ever giving him my Instagram. He was watching me, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just trying to be friendly in a weird, awkward way. One day he took a picture of my car, parked right outside the building, and sent it to me with the message, "Are you home alone?" That gave me chills. I stopped responding to him after that, hoping he'd take the hint and leave me alone. But Ryan didn't take the hint. In fact, his messages became more frequent as the days went by. I'd receive DMs from him at all hours. Random pictures, some of them just black screens with messages saying things like, "I'm just walking by your place," or "Late night walk, couldn't sleep." It was unnerving, but I tried to ignore it. He wasn't exactly doing anything illegal. Yet, one night, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to unwind after a long day of work. That's when I got another DM from Ryan. This time, it wasn't one of his usual random pictures. It was a direct message that read, "I know you're home alone." My stomach dropped. How did he know? My roommates had been gone for weeks and I hadn't seen Ryan in days. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just guessing. Maybe he knew it was winter break and assumed my roommates were gone. Still, the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, drew the curtains shut, and crawled back into bed. I didn't respond to the message. I told myself he was just trying to mess with me, but I couldn't shake the creeping sensation of being watched. A few nights later, I was woken up by a ping from my phone. Confused, I checked the time. It was 3 a.m. I picked up my phone and saw another DM from Ryan. It was a video message. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The video was short, maybe only a few seconds long, but it showed a clip of my apartment building, filmed from the parking lot. The timestamp showed that it had been taken just minutes ago. My heart raced as I scrambled to the window and peeked out, but the parking lot was empty. No sign of Ryan or anyone else. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I quickly typed a message, "Where are you?" but before I could hit send, I heard it. A faint buzzing sound coming from the living room. I froze. The buzzing continued. Quietly, I slid out of bed and tiptoed toward the living room, my heart pounding in my ears. The sound was coming from under the couch. I slowly bent down and lifted the edge of the couch cover. There, lying in the dark, was a phone. It wasn't mine. My pulse quickened. How did a phone I didn't recognize end up in my apartment? Panicking, I grabbed it and rushed back to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I opened Instagram and sent Ryan a message, "Why are you doing this?" Very seconds later, his Bitmoji appeared in the chat. He was typing. My stomach twisted in knots as I waited for his response. But then he stopped. No reply. Suddenly, another message popped up. It was just one word "look" attached to. It was a picture of my bedroom door. From the hallway, my breath caught in my throat. I dropped the phone, too terrified to move. I stood there, frozen, as the doorknob slowly started to turn. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I backed up against the wall, clutching a nearby lamp, ready to defend myself. The door creaked open, and there he was, Ryan. Standing in the doorway, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Why didn't you answer me?" he whispered, stepping closer. I screamed, throwing the lamp at him with all my strength. He ducked, but the lamp shattered against the wall, giving me just enough time to sprint past him. I bolted down the stairs, my bare feet slapping against the cold floor, and dashed out into the freezing night without looking back. I didn't stop running until I reached the gas station at the end of the street. Breathless and shaking, I burst through the doors and frantically told the cashier what had happened. He called the police for me. They arrived quickly, but by the time they got to my apartment, Ryan was gone. They searched the place and found his phone, hidden under the couch where I discovered it. But Ryan had disappeared. For the next few weeks, I couldn't bring myself to stay in that apartment alone. I crashed at a friend's place, too scared to return to the place where Ryan had invaded my personal space. When my roommates came back from break, we all agreed to move out as soon as we could. We broke the lease and found a new place on the other side of town. I never saw Ryan again, and I have no idea what happened to him after that night. I deleted my Instagram account, terrified that he might still be lurking somewhere out there. But the memory of him standing in my bedroom, watching me, has never left me. Even now, I struggle to feel safe living alone. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I hear the soft creak of a doorknob turning, and I wonder, will Ryan come back?